This is Mr. Nobody here with another installment on the MAGA Republican and the American Constitution. If there's anybody who has respect for the American Constitution today, it is the MAGA Republican, more so than anyone else could ever rightly lay claim to. But let's understand what we mean by this, because the American Constitution has a very interesting history. A history that I think some people don't pay a lot of attention to, but is highly relevant. For one, this was a rather surprising piece of information I came across fairly recently, and that is that it is not only one of the very first of the constitutions. I suspect that some parts of the Magna Carta could be conceived as a kind of a constitution. At least it had some of the Bill of Rights type things in it, but it wasn't exactly the full definition of a government or even the top level, but it's probably the closest thing. In terms of really trying to define a government and the way it works from the top level, it appears to be something, the very first of a kind that now has become extremely popular with most governments around the world. Some of them have serious, reasonable, responsibly written constitutions that make for a relatively stable and prosperous society. Others, not so much, and some kind of go from replacing one with another, and as it happens, the American Constitution is by far the longest single-serving constitution of any nation in existence. But when we say it's unchanged, and another interesting detail, I think even George Washington himself was still thinking it'll probably be replaced with something within 20 years. Let's balance those two statements. The thing is around. But one of the great things about the Constitution, it wasn't perfect, but it was a very good attempt. And what it primarily focused on as originally drafted was simply the structure of government, by trying to produce as much different kinds of accountability as possible. You distribute the chances of any one person being able to be corrupt and ruin or tyrannize the country. We wanted to get away from that as much as we could, and we're just human beings trying to do our imperfect but human level best, trying to make what's probably fundamentally either impossible or very difficult into something that is actually kind of sort of doable. And it's been a good way of doing things. See, the original Constitution, when you look at it, most of the articles are concerned with each taking a branch. Here's an article about the legislature. It's going to have the Senate. It's going to have representatives. And then the next one, we talk about the executive. There's a president. The president can have a cabinet of advisors and other people like that. And then there's a whole nother section about the Supreme Court and so forth. So you got all this very good things that kind of structure the government, with the idea being that all three different parts of the government have significantly different roles, and they care not to intervene in each other's role or to neutralize each other in any way, shape, or form. So even right there, and then there's a lot of other things. It talked about some of the states and so forth too. And there were certain things that were meant to be delegated down to the states. So even these structural things have been they're so basic to the Constitution. You don't monkey with those things. There are subtler details that could be changed. And this is where we get to the other really interesting thing about the American Constitution, is that it has the ability to be changed. Not just simply scrap the whole thing and start fresh. I mean, this makes me think of a movie I saw where this guy is granted 7 wishes, and each wish he makes, he just totally screws up because he doesn't really know anything. And yeah, the one granting the wishes is kind of trying to cheat him as your typical, wish granting, monkey puzzle demon, whatever it is, will all tend to do. But on the other hand, the person's also making very obvious and very stupid mistakes. And each time he tries one thing, he makes a mess of it, and so that wish is over. Then he makes a completely different wish, and the problem is he never learns. He doesn't find at the start one thing he wants and just work on perfecting that. So you do it one time and you discover, well, this is pretty good, but there's some problems. And you kind of endure it as long as you can, see how many problems you can find, and then you wish again the same thing with a few changes that will prevent all the problems you've experienced. Now, maybe new problems will come along, but with each iteration, you can get to a point that by the time you're done your seventh wish, it'll be virtually impossible for very much of anything to go wrong. And you've made real progress. You'll end up with something maybe you could live with. Maybe even something that might be a genuine improvement. But no, the person's a moron. They make a wish, it doesn't work out. They wish for something completely different. And that doesn't work either. I won't name the movie, I won't name the story, and there's probably any number of tales, wish fulfillment tales that follow a similar line anyway. But the moral I draw from that is this. If you really seriously had such a situation, you would want to keep revising an existing wish and perfecting an existing wish. This was really good, but I need to tweak this. All right, let's tweak this. And so on until eventually you've tweaked the whole thing into something that could work, maybe. And that's the real advantage to keeping what is, in all senses, the same Constitution, as opposed to scrapping the whole thing and starting with another one, and then later on scrapping that one and doing another one, and so on. I mean, I've heard France has had 3 constitutions since they began doing constitutions, and that's a pretty good, strong, relatively stable country, you'd think, but they still had to do that. But we took the existing one, and it has the process of amendment. I think another article is devoted specifically to that. And by being about the process of amendment, you can fix things that were major oversights. I mean, the Basic Rights of the Bill of Rights, for example, was a huge oversight. And right away, everybody saw, we need to do this right now. And they did. And I think that, that really defined a lot about it. So, it's grown, it's changed, and I'll even have to admit, once in a while, sometimes things didn't work out very well, and it had to be, an amendment to the Constitution at one point did something that sounded like it should be a good thing, I guess, but it worked so much evil that 13 years later they had to make another amendment, basically to just undo the previous one. If you're a historian, you probably know the one I'm talking about. The one about making alcohol illegal everywhere, the Prohibition years. They thought, well, good, people won't get drunk anymore, and we'll have a good, orderly society. Instead, they just got drunk illegally everywhere, and a whole underground market for the stuff developed, which fed gangsters and so forth. I mean, Al Capone would probably not have, gotten anywhere near so far without illegal alcohol, being his basis for stuff. And that's exactly what was going on. So they finally just said, this is really not working. You need to just undo it. And they did. And I don't say it fixed everything, but it just goes to show that sometimes that's not the way to fix a thing, and that's okay. So that was the great thing, was the process to amend it. Even if on occasion an amendment may be a mistake, it can be undone if need be. So we care for this a great deal. It's a very special, it's a national treasure, really. Okay, it's a human artifact. Even now, I can't say it's a perfect thing. No human creation is. But I think as human creations go of this sort of thing, it's done really good. And I can't see replacing it with anything. If there's a real weakness found, maybe an amendment may be called for. And that has been in, how many times in the course of American history. But that is all. You don't just scrap it and start again all the way from scratch. Because there's a lot that is working really well. So we want to keep it. We want to keep the things. And yes, there's a lot of amendments where things stand today. Some things better than others, but all things overall add up to something that, as human creations go, is very, very good and something genuinely to be proud of in a way as an American. And we hope other countries have things they can be proud of, but this is something we can be proud of. And I'm sure with great justice. So we care about these things. Now, let's go back to the basics of this. Let's start with the original Constitution itself. We believe that the three, portions of the federal government should really be distinct and separate and each carry out their distinct functions. So you have the legislative, you have the executive, and you have the judicial. Very straightforward. When you start having one group try to do another or interfere with the way another works, you're just setting stuff up for something to go wrong. Yeah, we may not always like some of the decisions the Supreme Court makes. They can sometimes be a bit of a wild card and so forth. But on the other hand, if we want to get into a mode of, well, if we don't like their decisions, we'll pack the court with new justices who will give us what we want. The moment you start doing that, you compromise the whole independence of that entire third of our federal government. So, there's a lot of people who may admire Franklin Roosevelt, but he tried to pack the court. Luckily, that didn't carry through. There's been threats of it. At the moment, as I talk, that seems to kind of eased off a bit, but we all know that's circling around out there and suddenly come back to bite us in the butt, and suddenly there's this massive move to pack the court. Next time they make some unpopular decision, that can happen. So that was one thing right there. Okay, now another thing is that that basic document allocates certain things to the legislatures of the individual states. There's a couple of things I can think of that are relevant here. One is the state's manner of choosing how it's going to elect, how the state is going to conduct its election for the president, and maybe also its own internal elections for its own internal officers. States have a fair amount of say in these things, and different states can do different things. It's up to the state legislatures to do this. That's right there in the Constitution. We had a lot of problem because basically what the state legislatures had come up with was just basically brushed under the rug and swept aside and ignored. And then all kinds of stuff went wrong. And I hope to be able to get that to a future session here. But for right now, let's just start with that one. That's who's supposed to do it. That's who has the job. And that's not just something left to a state that if the governor wants to take over that role, he can just do it because it's up to the state as a whole. No, it is specifically assigned to state legislature, period. Now, legislature could go by a different name. It could be assembly, it could be whatever. But it's those people that operate in bodies that correspond fairly closely to the bodies, to the respective parts of the federal government. We have state courts, we have state, legislatures, and those are the legislatures. Some states they might call it assembly, but it's the people who make the laws of the state. And then we have a state executive, which of course comes in the form of the governor, and so on. So we have all these things. All right, point number 2. How do we divvy up election districts? There's always the danger of gerrymandering. It's a bad thing, but the key thing is, however that gets done, however a state gets territorially broken up for different precincts and so forth, bottom line is that is also explicitly left to the states. So right there, that's another principle. Now, one more principle I'll get. Well, no, let's go to the next part. Now let's move to the Bill of Rights. Though that was the first 10 most important amendments to the Constitution. Now, I'm not sure whether they would fit in the document of the Constitution if you had to try to consider the Constitution a document, that you are revising this document, and suddenly into its structure of yea many articles, you're inserting the Bill of Rights and so on. I'm not quite sure how that works. But at any rate, we know that this Bill of Rights is so basic and so essential that you just don't question that anymore. And maybe some details can be refined a wee bit, but on the whole, you don't question it. So basic freedoms, it's not the state's place to tell us what we're going to say, what we're going to think, what we're going to print. That's not up to the state to decide those things. And yeah, I know it seems like there ought to be some mechanism for accountability, because you can always spread propaganda and misinformation. But I'll tell you what, you can also, censorship makes it very easy to hide the truth. And that is so extremely dangerous that it's better to have a lot of crap floating around information-wise than to have the factual information carefully and scientifically kept out of the public forum. That was basically the decision made by the the American founding fathers and constitutionalists who drafted the Bill of Rights and argued over all of that. So now the next part is, what about freedom of religion? Well, it's not the state's job to set up a state church. So, if a state can't tell what is or isn't right, it's probably best it just admit its own incompetence in the matter and leave that decision to the people. Period. But they certainly can't go closing churches while keeping casinos open, all in the name of, we don't want diseases to spread. We saw some things about that going on in the last couple of years. So that's one thing. In a sense, atheism, secular humanism, these are religion too. You don't think of it because they don't have a personal God in the ordinary sense of, you think of religion, you think of a God, but these things are also a particular religious sect. And all too often we want to pull all reference of God out of anything and every place you can. Take it out of the schools, take 10 Commandments, out of the schools, and all these kinds of things. Not that anybody's going to live that much different because of that, but the symbolism does matter, because if you take these things out, which, if it just wasn't there in the first place, that's one thing. But it's there for whatever reason, and now you want to take it away, that's not right. That gives a message, and it's not a good one. It's like saying we want God out of the schools. So that's not right, because it's not that they're advocating some particular religion. Not really. Different. First of all, you could carve up the 10 Commandments different ways somewhat, but it's the same thing. You could go to other religions where it might be the 7-fold path of this, or the 8 rules of that, or what have you. And you know what? Most of that boils down to most of the same kinds of things, because a lot of that is just based on natural law that people should just automatically know is right anyway. That's just where it's stated explicitly in the name of God, in some vague general sense that as an American, politically speaking, you invoke God in a generic sense, as you do when you see on your money, "In God we trust," or when we say in our Pledge of Allegiance, "One nation under God, indivisible," Or when we swear upon a Bible, do you swear so help me God? Yes. You know, we're not trying to invoke this, we're not trying to be too specific because it's not our government's job to try to get that kind of specific. They've admitted their incompetency in the role. Who are we to argue with that? There it is. We can move on to other amendments. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Well, we all know who's been trying to take that right away from people. They wanted to have it so that only irresponsible people will have guns, and the rest of us trying to be law-abiding will be terrorized because we're not allowed to have them. The criminals won't care, and you say, well, they won't get them. Well, first of all, gangsters will, and second of all, other kinds of criminals will find ways to get them. They just will. It's just harder, but that's all you can do is make it a little bit harder. So some crazy teenager wants to do something stupid. It's not going to be so easy. Okay, that's fine. But you're not going to do anything about a gangster because they've got their own supply chain. And you can't interfere with that. I mean, it's just not physically possible, or at least not without a real war on your hands. That right now, I think we've got a country that's not ready to fight any war. But I can talk about that another time. So, now we move on. The rights of the accused. It's like, on the one hand, some people just get caught and released. Yeah, this person did this terrible, destructive crime, but we like this person politically, so let him go. Or this other person was trespassing somewhere. Where strictly speaking, it's not really trespassing, but anyway, we'll say that. So we could throw him in jail. No trial, no nothing, no indictment, no procedure, no nothing. They just get in there and they throw away the key, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of people rotting away in jail for some infraction that really would amount to, at most a speeding violation or something, if even that. We can go on through some of the other amendments. I'm going to take just one more right now, and that has to do with not taking away from the states or from the people anything other than what things are specifically called out in the Constitution. So that means the states really are states proper and not just provinces. There's a difference. It's not a province is a mere geographical territory, nothing more. But a state is like a little quasi-mini nation, even if we add together to a large one. There's the old saying, e pluribus unum. It's been on our money even longer than in God we trust. And you know what that means? They have a symbol. All these sticks bound tightly together that make a very powerful club, as opposed to individual sticks that wouldn't amount to very much. What's the point of it? United we stand, divided we fall. You see, the different states have their distinctive set of laws and other procedural things, and maybe even some philosophical outlooks and so forth that dominate the way this or that state is run. And granted, some are discernibly run better than others. In a way, that's a good thing because it gives everyone a chance to see. If we run this thing intelligently, something works out. If we run this thing stupidly, it becomes a home of crime and, runaway homelessness and joblessness and, and all these other terrible things. And you can say, well, what do you want? And you have a choice. You see what works and you see what doesn't. And that's all part of the American experiment. So, again, there are things delegated to the state. So that's the 10th Amendment. And then we can move on. Well, we know there were some things that were serious oversights. They said all men are equal. Well, they actually had to solve the question, does that include slaves? Well, you can't enslave anybody anymore, and with good cause. I mean, of course not. I mean, you kind of understand that now, but in the 1840s, 50s, and into the 1860s, there was a real divide in our nation about that. It was a real question. So you have to weigh these things, but bottom line is you don't do wrong stuff. And here was another one. Okay, every man has all these very rights. Well, what about a woman? You know, well, in the old days, of course, grammatically, we all understood. We would say he, even when we didn't know the gender of the person. It's like he didn't have to mean that we implied that it was a guy. They say he just simply said it could be sort of the way we're seeing the word they get used a lot. So if it works, if we just put it in a plural context, then they is absolutely fine and would have always been fine. It's just kind of using they in a singular sense. It's kind of weird and kind of non-grammatical, but that's kind of become a fad. But it kind of conveys the idea of what originally was conveyed in he. We're not saying, well, the burglar, he broke in through the window. He, how do you know it wasn't a she? Well, we don't know that. We don't know anything about that. We just say he in a generic sense that could refer to anybody. So when we say every man is free, that's really more like every human is free. But it obviously paid to get explicit about that because some people think, well, you said the men are free. You didn't say the women are free. All right, let's clarify that detail. Everyone, man, woman, is free. Man, woman makes no difference, is free. Okay. So we can go on down the line. A lot of our amendments really made a lot of sense. So that's a very important, valuable thing. And I don't see anybody out there fighting to preserve that. You see, there are procedures. If something really does legitimately have to be made, you've got to get a lot of the country behind it. And that's good. It's possible where there's a clear and real and legitimate need for a change, but at the same time, it doesn't get changed every time some one or other political party gains a 50.5% majority and says, we want everything run this way. And then another party says, no, we want it all this way and this way. No, that's the beauty of the way the Constitution is set up. It is something worth defending. And it is something that, nobody defends to anywhere near the degree MAGA Republicans, and Trump and all the other, strong Republicans have always done. We are the defenders of the American Constitution. Par excellence. That's it.